On September 26, 1346, a 16-year-old prince stood on a hill at Crécy, surrounded by 30,000 French corpses. Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, had just commanded his first battle, and his father, King Edward III, had refused to send help, declaring, "Let the boy win his spurs." The boy had done more than that. He'd annihilated the flower of French chivalry, standing calm as blind King John of Bohemia charged to certain death, as French knights trampled their own crossbowmen, as Europe's most powerful army dissolved into bloody chaos. The Golden Prince in black armor was knighted on the field, surrounded by admiring nobles who called him the perfect embodiment of chivalry. No one could have imagined that this shining hero would become medieval Europe's most notorious killer. Edward was everything medieval society idealized in a warrior prince. Tall, handsome, educated in languages and warfare, generous to his followers, and supposedly merciful to defeated enemies. After capturing King John II of France at Poitiers in 1356, he famously served the king dinner personally, claiming he wasn't worthy to sit at the same table as royalty. Chroniclers praised his courtesy, his religious devotion, his perfect adherence to chivalric codes. He founded religious chapels, gave alms to the poor, and wore the ostrich feather badge with the humble motto, "Ich diene," I serve. French nobles who surrendered to him initially spoke of his honor and proper treatment. He was, by every standard of his age, the perfect Christian knight, but something darker lurked beneath the shining armor. Even at Crécy, observers noted how he watched the French nobles drowning in their own blood with peculiar satisfaction. During his first independent command in 1355, he began developing what he called the chevauchée, a military strategy that was essentially systematic terrorism. The idea was simple: destroy everything that could support life. Burn crops, poison wells, slaughter livestock, destroy mills, burn churches, level entire towns, and kill anyone who couldn't be ransomed. Make the land so desolate that it couldn't support armies, governments, or even basic civilization. It was total war 5 centuries before the term was invented. The 1355 Grand Chevauchée carved a 900-mile path of absolute destruction across southern France. Starting from Bordeaux, the Black Prince's army destroyed over 500 towns and villages, including the complete annihilation of Carcassonne's lower town, which never recovered its medieval prosperity. His explicit orders were to burn and destroy everything. Soldiers were paid bonuses for the most thorough destruction. Churches were specifically targeted, not for their wealth, but to break French morale. Monks and priests were tortured to reveal hidden valuables, then killed anyway. The psychological impact was devastating. French peasants began believing the English were demons sent by God to punish them for unknown sins. The Black Prince refined terror into military science. He would leave one survivor from each village, usually a child, to run to the next settlement and describe what was coming. He displayed mutilated bodies along roads in artistic arrangements, heads on pikes, forming arrows pointing toward his next target. Wells were poisoned with human corpses and dead animals, ensuring that even after his army passed, death would linger. One French chronicler wrote, "The English came not as warriors, but as harvesters of death, leaving nothing but crows and wolves to inhabit what were once prosperous lands. For 7 years after their passing, no birds sang." The Battle of Poitiers in 1356 cemented the Black Prince's military reputation while revealing his true nature. Outnumbered 2-1, he destroyed the French army and captured King John II. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactics, but the aftermath showed his evolving cruelty. While he treated the king with elaborate courtesy for propaganda purposes, common French soldiers were systematically executed. Those who couldn't pay ransom were blinded and released to be burdens on French society. The contrast between his treatment of valuable nobles and worthless commoners exposed the lie of chivalric honor. It only applied to those who could pay. In 1367, the Black Prince intervened in the Castilian Civil War, restoring Pedro the Cruel to the Spanish throne. The campaign revealed new depths of depravity. He watched approvingly as Pedro murdered his own brother with a dagger, then helped execute 7,000 prisoners after the Battle of Nájera. Spanish chronicles describe rivers running red for 7 days, but Spain would have its revenge. The prince contracted what historians believe was dysentery or cancer during the campaign. The disease would spend the next 9 years slowly rotting him from the inside, what many contemporaries saw as divine punishment for his crimes in God's own kingdom of Castile. As Prince of Aquitaine from 1362 to 1371, Edward transformed from military terrorist to economic vampire. He imposed crushing taxes that drove noble families into poverty and caused merchants to flee. The hearth tax he instituted was so burdensome that entire villages were abandoned. He sold safe passages to merchants, then had them robbed by bandits who were actually his soldiers. Towns were forced to pay protection money or face destruction. When the Aquitanian nobles finally rebelled, they cited not just the taxes, but the complete breakdown of law and justice under his rule. The perfect knight had become a perfect extortionist, squeezing his subjects until they had nothing left to give. After Spain, the Black Prince was never the same. The illness that struck him was described by contemporaries as a great sickness and rotting of the blood. He couldn't ride a horse, instead being carried in a litter like a corpse. His skin turned yellow and black in patches. He suffered constant fever and bloody flux. Some days he couldn't even stand, yet the sickness seemed to make him crueler, as if his rotting body was revealing his rotting soul. He ordered executions from his sickbed, planned massacres while fevered, and signed death warrants when he could barely hold a quill. His own knights began avoiding him, claiming his presence brought bad luck. The massacre of Limoges in 1370 destroyed whatever remained of the Black Prince's reputation. When the city defected to the French, he took it personally. After a 6-month siege that starved the population into eating rats and leather, he ordered every living soul killed. 3,000 civilians, men, women, children, priests, everyone, were systematically butchered. Soldiers went house to house with axes. Babies were thrown down wells. Pregnant women were cut open. The Bishop of Limoges crawled to the prince's litter, begging for mercy on his knees. The prince, too sick to stand, but not too sick to hate, watched it all from his litter, giving specific orders about who should die how. French chronicler Jean Froissart, who had previously praised the Black Prince, wrote of Limoges, "It was a great pity to see the men, women, and children who kneeled before the prince, crying for mercy. But he was so inflamed with anger that he listened to no one. More than 3,000 were put to the sword. God have mercy on their souls, for they were true martyrs." Even English knights were horrified. Some refused to participate. Others carried out the orders, but later testified they had nightmares for years. The French began calling him the Terror of God, believing he was divine punishment made flesh for humanity's sins. The Black Prince's methods, horrific as they were, revolutionized medieval warfare. He proved that chivalry was a luxury that victory couldn't afford. His chevauchés showed that economic destruction was more effective than battlefield victories. His use of terror as a weapon taught future commanders that breaking enemy morale was easier than breaking their armies. He turned war from a noble sport into systematic destruction. The age of gallant knights meeting in honorable combat died with his campaigns. In its place rose the age of professional soldiers, total war, and the understanding that in war there were no innocents, only targets. The prince surrounded himself with men who shared his evolving brutality. His Welsh longbowmen were notorious for their cruelty, often blinding prisoners by shooting out their eyes for sport. His Gascon mercenaries, led by men like Jean de Grailly, were given free rein to pillage and murder. These weren't noble knights, but professional killers who saw war as business and terror as a tool. The prince protected them from all criticism, even when they raped nuns or burned pilgrims alive. He created a military culture where the worst atrocities were not just permitted, but rewarded. The more brutal the soldier, the higher he rose in the prince's service. Throughout his descent into monstrosity, the Black Prince maintained elaborate religious observances. He founded chantry chapels where monks would pray for his soul in perpetuity. He made pilgrimages to shrines, always leaving generous donations. Before each massacre, he heard mass. After each atrocity, he confessed and received absolution. He carried religious relics into battle and claimed his victories were God's will. This wasn't seen as hypocrisy in medieval times, but as proper Christian warfare, killing the body to save the soul. Yet even by medieval standards, his combination of piety and cruelty was extreme. He would pray while ordering executions, take communion before commanding massacres. The prince's brutality ultimately destroyed everything he had fought to win. The Aquitanian nobles, who had initially welcomed English rule, were driven to rebellion by his tyranny. Town after town defected back to France, preferring French law to English terror. By 1371, almost all the territories won over decades of war were lost. The prince, now too sick to fight, could only watch from his litter as his life's work crumbled. He tried one last campaign, attempting to burn Montpellier with its entire population inside, but failed even at this final atrocity. He resigned as Prince of Aquitaine in humiliation, carried back to England on a ship, weeping with rage and fever. The Black Prince's son, Richard II, would pay for his father's sins. Inheriting the throne at age 10, Richard was haunted by his father's legacy. He tried to make peace with France, to end the endless wars his father had glorified. The English nobles, grown rich on French plunder, overthrew him. He was murdered, probably starved to death, in Pontefract Castle at age 33. The direct line of the Black Prince ended with a murdered king, as if the very bloodline was cursed. French chroniclers saw divine justice in this end, the sins of the father visited upon the son. The perfect knight's dynasty died as violently as the thousands he had killed. The Black Prince's campaigns left economic scars that lasted generations. The regions he devastated in the 1350s still showed massive population decline in the 1420s. Agricultural production in southern France didn't recover to pre-war levels for over a century. The destruction of infrastructure, mills, bridges, irrigation systems, set back economic development by decades. Trade routes were abandoned, entire industries destroyed, currency systems collapsed. The cost of his victories in pure economic terms exceeded any plunder gained. He had won battles, but destroyed the very wealth that made the territories worth fighting for. Medieval economists called it making a desert and calling it peace. Before the Black Prince, wars were largely conflicts between nobles with peasants as incidental victims. His systematic targeting of civilians created something new: national hatred. French peasants who had never cared which noble ruled them now despised the English with personal passion. This hatred transcended class. Merchants, priests, nobles and peasants united in their desire for revenge. The prince had inadvertently created French nationalism through shared suffering. This emotional transformation would eventually drive the English from France entirely. Joan of Arc's ability to rally France stemmed directly from the national trauma the Black Prince had inflicted. He won every battle, but created the conditions for England's ultimate defeat. The Black Prince's last years were a descent into physical and mental hell. His body was rotting, wounds wouldn't heal, his teeth fell out, his hair turned white. He suffered hallucinations, claiming to see the ghosts of those he'd killed. His temper became uncontrollable. He once had a servant beaten to death for spilling wine. He couldn't sleep without massive doses of poppy wine. On good days, he could sit up and dictate letters ordering executions. On bad days, he screamed about demons coming for his soul. Even his own family avoided him. His father, the king, visited rarely. His wife stayed in separate chambers. His surviving brothers found excuses to be elsewhere. On June 8, 1376, Trinity Sunday, the Black Prince died at age 45. His death was as horrible as his life had become. Witnesses described him alternating between begging God for forgiveness and cursing his enemies for damnation. He supposedly saw visions of the massacre victims surrounding his bed. His final words were reportedly, "I have done evil. I know it. I know it," though English chroniclers claimed he died peacefully after confession. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral with an epitaph praising his nobility and courage. But his tomb effigy, showing a perfect knight in shining armor, was perhaps the greatest lie of all. The real Black Prince had died as he lived, in blood and horror. The Black Prince's death brought no peace to England or France. The power vacuum he left sparked new conflicts. His father, Edward III, died a year later, leaving the child, Richard II, on the throne. The French, emboldened by the removal of their greatest tormentor, immediately began reconquering lost territory. English garrisons he had established were systematically besieged and destroyed. The mercenary companies he had employed turned to brigandage, terrorizing the very lands they once protected. His military innovations, the professionalization of warfare, the use of economic destruction, were adopted by all sides, making war even more terrible. His legacy was not victory, but endless, escalating violence. The French response to the Black Prince's death was celebration mixed with continued fear. Churches across France held services of thanksgiving. But mothers still used his name to frighten children. "Be good, or the Black Prince will get you." Sites of his massacres became pilgrimage destinations where people came to pray for the dead. The French nobility, many of whom had lost fathers and brothers to his campaigns, swore oaths of revenge that would drive the war for another generation. French military doctrine was completely reorganized to counter his tactics, avoiding pitched battles, using guerrilla warfare, targeting English supply lines. They had learned from their tormentor, becoming as ruthless as he had been. English historians immediately began rehabilitating the Black Prince's image. Chronicles were edited to minimize atrocities and emphasize chivalric deeds. The massacre at Limoges was reduced from 3,000 to 300, then described as a military necessity. His economic extortion was reframed as efficient administration. The systematic destruction of French countryside became strategic brilliance. Victorian historians turned him into a romantic hero, the perfect medieval knight fighting for England's glory. French sources describing his atrocities were dismissed as enemy propaganda. This whitewashing was so effective that even today, many English remember him as a hero rather than the war criminal he actually was. The Black Prince's true legacy was the transformation of warfare from limited noble conflict to total war. His chevauché strategy would be used for centuries. Sherman's march to the sea in the American Civil War followed his blueprint exactly. His use of terror to break civilian morale became standard military doctrine. His economic warfare, destroying the enemy's ability to make war rather than just defeating their armies, predated modern strategic thinking by 500 years. Military academies still study his campaigns, though they focus on tactics rather than atrocities. He proved that in war, brutality worked better than honor, a lesson humanity has never forgotten. Modern archaeology confirms the chronicler's accounts of the Black Prince's brutality. Excavations at sites along his campaign routes reveal layers of ash consistent with total destruction. Mass graves dating to the 1350s-70s show evidence of violence against civilians, women and children with sword wounds, skulls showing execution-style killings. At Limoges, construction work in the 1960s uncovered a mass burial site with remains of approximately 300 individuals, all showing trauma consistent with massacre rather than battle. Coin hoards buried during his campaigns and never recovered suggest populations that fled or died. The physical evidence supports the darkest interpretations of his legacy. Medieval theologians struggled to reconcile the Black Prince's obvious evil with his Christian victories. Some argued he was God's scourge, like Attila, sent to punish sinful France. Others claimed his illness and horrible death proved divine judgment. The Pope never officially condemned him, needing English support against French dominance, but several bishops privately wrote that his soul was surely damned. Miracle stories arose of his victims becoming saints through martyrdom. The chapel he built at Canterbury, where he's buried, was said to be haunted by those he killed. Pilgrims reported hearing screams and seeing blood on his tomb. The Church's verdict was unspoken but clear. Hero or not, the Black Prince was hellbound. Modern psychologists studying historical accounts have theorized about the Black Prince's transformation from hero to monster. Some suggest the pressure of living up to his father's expectations drove him to extremes. Others point to possible brain damage from head injuries in battle affecting his judgment and empathy. The disease that killed him might have caused neurological changes, increasing aggression and reducing impulse control. But the most compelling theory is simpler. War revealed his true nature. The chivalric knight was always a mask hiding a sadistic killer who found in warfare the perfect excuse to indulge his darkest impulses. The perfect knight was perfect precisely because he perfectly embodied warfare's essential brutality. While chroniclers focused on nobles and battles, occasional glimpses of common victims survive. A French merchant's letter describes finding his entire family dead after a chevauchée. A priest's diary from Carcassonne records burying 847 parishioners in 3 days. A mother's song, preserved in oral tradition, laments children fed to English swords. These fragments remind us that beyond the statistics were real people, farmers, merchants, priests, children, whose lives were destroyed by one man's military genius. The Black Prince killed more French civilians than soldiers. His victims weren't warriors who chose battle, but innocents who happened to live where armies passed. Their voices, mostly lost to history, whisper accusations that no amount of historical revision can silence. The supreme irony of the Black Prince's life is that everything he achieved was lost within a generation. Every city he conquered returned to France. Every noble family he elevated fell from power. The dynasty he fought to establish ended with his son's murder. England spent centuries and countless lives trying to hold French territory, but ultimately lost everything except Calais. The 100 Years' War he helped start ended in total English defeat. His tactical innovations made war more terrible, but didn't change its outcome. He caused immeasurable suffering for absolutely nothing. The perfect knight's perfect victories led to perfect failure. History's judgment is clear. The Black Prince was both medieval Europe's most feared killer and its most futile. Today, the Black Prince exists in 2 completely different versions. In England, he's still often portrayed as a chivalric hero, with pubs, streets, and schools bearing his name. His tomb at Canterbury remains a tourist attraction where guides speak of his military genius while glossing over his atrocities. In France, particularly in regions he devastated, he's remembered as Le Prince Noir, the Black Prince, with all the sinister implications that name carries. Limoges has never forgotten its massacre. Carcassonne's museum displays evidence of his destruction. The split memory reflects how nations construct different histories from the same events. The perfect knight to some remains the perfect monster to others, and perhaps that duality is his truest legacy.